Well, let's take a look at some other textbook sort of concerns. I like to use Calvin and Hobbes. You can't teach science without using Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin, your mom and I looked over your report card and we think you could be doing better. But I don't like school. Why not? You like to read and you like to learn. I know you do. I mean, you've read every dinosaur book ever written, right? Reading and learning are fun. Yeah. So why don't you like school? We don't read about dinosaurs. Well, yeah, dinosaurs are fun, and this has been used, of course, to teach evolution terrifically, but dinosaurs are mentioned in the Bible. That's something I did at one of the churches today and talked about that. We can certainly go into that in question and answer period. But the education of kids in the evolutionary whole mindset starts way earlier than you think. My kindergartner, well, my daughter's 13, when she came home from kindergarten, she brought home a book that said that dinosaurs existed millions of years ago. You don't believe me? Look at this. Dr. Seuss. From fossils, dinosaurs, teeth, eggs, and bone got stuck in the muck, and that muck turned to stone. These fossils are old. They are dusty and worn because they were made long before you were born. Not hundreds of years, not thousands of years, but millions of years long before you were born. In Dr. Seuss books. That's pretty early. You do find it early. Well, this is one of my favorite scientists. He is not a creationist, but he's Linus Pauling and created a lot of things. This is the man who invented the whole thing that vitamin C is good for the common cold. He also developed the principle of electronegativity in 1932. Okay. Won the Nobel Prize for that, not for the vitamin C stuff. He also won the Nobel Peace Prize. And look what Dr. Pauling says about science. He started the Linus Pauling Institute when he was 77 years old. You know, the man was very active into the 1990s. Well, till he died, of course. But anyway, Dr. Pauling says science is a search for the truth, the effort to understand the world. That's how I see science. I was debating 3 evolutionists at DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana, and when I made the statement, well, science and religion are both a search for the truth, the 3 other guys practically fell out of their chairs, eager to say, no, 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 no. Science is not a search for the truth. It's a discussion. Which was supposed to be smart. That mindset generates new graduates from colleges, new authors of textbooks, and new textbook curricula. This is a textbook written by Kenneth Miller. This is actually the textbook that you use here in the state of Indianapolis for your high school kids. I've met Kenneth Miller. I've debated with him. They couldn't use any of the footage for WGBH-TV because it did not go good for the evolution side. And but Dr. Miller's book, Biology here, was they put a little sticker in Cobb County, Georgia on this thing in the year 2002. Unanimously, the Cobb County School Board voted they want to put this sticker in there because the book is so evolutionist. Now look at this narrow-minded sticker. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. Well, you'd think we put something on there that said Nazis are good, because the outrage across the country over poor little Cobb County, Georgia school system trying to mind their own business and run their own school system the way they saw fit. Look at this. It took years, but 3 years later, January 14th, a federal district court judge commanded Cobb County to tear those stickers out of every single one of those textbooks. Look at it. Open-minded. We don't want any of that, you see. We don't want any of that. But look at what's happening. You're not alone. You know, if you don't believe in evolution, you're not alone. Look what it says. 2005, Washington Post. Even today, against all scientific fact, the Washington Post says, more Americans still believe that the earth is 6,000 years old and that the biblical flood of Noah shaped the modern world than subscribe to evolutionary theory and intelligent design put together. Isn't that awful? Isn't that awful? Well, let's take a look at some textbook stuff that we're talking about here. How many of you have ever seen this kind of thing in a science textbook that you grew up with or your kids have? Yes? Embryos, showing They look at the different embryos of different animals like a fish, a reptile, a bird, and a human and say, look how similar they are. That shows we all used to be the same thing. You know, they'll even say that since the human starts out as a fertilized egg, a single cell, that we came from single-celled animals, and us and single-celled animals are cousins. But I like what Dr. Duane T. Gish says, one of the most famous creationists in the world. He said, well, ladies and gentlemen, how else could you start out? There's no other way. You've got to start out as a single cell. That doesn't prove anything. That's like saying, look, evolution, you know, it goes along with evolution that the sky is blue. So, the sky is blue, evolution must be right. You see, that's not proof of evolution. If it could happen any other way, then you cannot use it as proof for your argument. If it can happen any other way, you cannot use it as proof for your argument. But we see this all the time. Let's take a look here. Here's another one. This is from Holt Reinhardt Winston, 1998. You see these kind of things. This one here from McGraw-Hill Science. And look what it says up in the corner here. These similarities among vertebrate embryos suggest that there is a common ancestor for all the vertebrates. That there's a common ancestor for all the vertebrates. Jennifer Clack, a very well-known evolutionist scientist, said just 2 years ago, she said, humans are not descended from Sarcopterygian fishes. We are Sarcopterygian fishes. You are just a mutated fish. And if you believe in evolution, that's exactly what you believe. They often don't say that in public, but they believe we came from fish. Oh yeah, then they turned into monkeys, and then we turned into us. You'll see this in the textbook. These are the drawings that first, how many of you have ever seen this particular one? This particular one. This is reprinted from a 1901 book, redrawn from G.J. Romain's Darwin After Darwin, Open Court Publishing Company, 1901. Let me tell you the story of how these pictures got in our textbooks that you recognize right now. Now, your textbook here in Indianapolis and in the state of Indiana, Dr. Miller's book, does not have this particular picture, but it has a picture of an embryo, and it says it really shows that we evolved. But Dr. Miller's book admits the story that I'm about to tell you is true. It says, but Dr. Miller says, but it doesn't matter, because evolution's still true. Now, the story I'm about to tell you is this. In 1859, Darwin publishes his book, The Origin of the Species. A lot of scientists like it right away. 3 years later, it's being taught at Cambridge. You know, evolution was very, very popular. You also got the president of Princeton decided to interpret the behemoth in the Bible as a hippopotamus and the Leviathan as a crocodile, even though the behemoth has a tail the size of a cedar tree. And of course, elephants and hippopotamus just have these little, you know, duster tails, like, okay, little broomstick tails. Well, okay, it caught on real fast, and a lot of evolutionists, a lot of atheists liked it. One atheist was Ernst Haeckel, a biology professor at Jena University in Germany. He wanted to help Darwin, so he drew these pictures showing an evolutionary transition for fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, rabbit, showing how back when we were in this stage of embryos, we all looked the same. And you saw those little circles that came and went looking at these things that Haeckel called the gill slits, showing that we used to be fish. The gill slits, right there. Now, those are really the pharyngeal pouches and grooves. There's a series of bars and grooves on the neck region of the embryo. These develop into the muscles that are the bed for the blood vessels and the nerves that go from the trunk into the skull. They also develop into parts of the inner ear and the thymus gland. They never have anything to do with breathing, so they're not gills. They never have anything to do with a hole from the neck into the throat, so they're not slits. If they're not gills and they're not slits, they're not gill slits. Now, I'm trying to make sense to you here, okay? But they'll tell you they're gill slits. Anyway, Haeckel drew the pictures, and in 1874, just 8 years later, he was found guilty of scientific fraud. He had faked the drawings and made the embryos look similar, even though they did not. And he was convicted of scientific fraud in 1874. The pictures got lost. His confession got lost. And then someone found these pictures 26 years later in a drawer and stuck them in this book, Darwin After Darwin, in 1901. And then they got into our college and high school textbooks, and they've been there ever since for 130 years. And they're not taking them out. It's a documented, this is history, fact. It's on the books, documented fraud, but it's still in the books. I didn't pick this because it's the best, most glaring example. I picked it because it's the most documented, but I'm picking it also because it has a long history, all the way back to Darwin's time, and still persists. Look what the evolutionist professor said in 1932 in a book called The Human Body. It was expected. Don't forget, 1874, Haeckel was found guilty of fraud. 1932, it was expected that the embryo would recapitulate. What do you do when you recap? You summarize, you do it over again. Yeah, it's an instant replay. Like, it was expected that the embryo would recap the features of its ancestors from the lowest forms to the highest forms in the animal kingdom. Now that the appearances of the embryo at all stages are known, because now everyone had looked through their microscopes and they knew, the general feeling is one of disappointment. The embryo at no state is anthropoid in appearance. The embryo at the mammal never resembles the worm or the fish or the reptile. Embryology provides no support whatsoever for the evolutionary hypothesis. They knew this in 1932. But in Dr. Miller's book, it says, next to the picture of the embryo, yes, Haeckel faked the drawings, but this is still good evidence of evolution. This is an article from Science magazine, one of the two most premier journals of science in the world. And it is entitled Haeckel's Embryos, Fraud Rediscovered. This is from 1998, and up here it says, generations of biology students may have been misled by a famous set of drawings of embryos published 123 years ago by the German biologist Ernst Haeckel. Take a look at some of the things in this. It's September 1997, page 1435. You want to look it up. It says here, Haeckel did not include limb buds. Human embryos have tiny protrusions called limb buds, says Richardson, particularly if they've developed to the point of having as many body segments as Haeckel gives them. But Haeckel did not include the limb buds. And in his drawings, the chick embryo eye is blackened, like a mammal's. But it wouldn't be pigmented this early, Richardson says. He adds that Haeckel had given the bird embryo a curl in the tail that resembles a human's. You know, the reason that the human embryo didn't have arms and legs in that picture is because he chopped them off to make them look more like a fish. That was just a fake. Not only did Haeckel add or omit features, Richardson and his colleagues report, but he also fudged the scale to exaggerate similarities among species, even when there were tenfold differences in size. It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology, Richardson concludes. This news might not have been so shocking to Haeckel's peers in Germany a century ago. They got Haeckel to admit that he relied on memory and used artistic license in preparing his drawings. You know, when I taught biology in high school and college, I told my students, when you draw stuff through the microscope, you open both eyes, you put one eye through the microscope, you put one eye on your paper, and you draw. That's how careful you're supposed to be when you draw things through. He wasn't even looking in the microscope when he drew the pictures. He did it by memory. He went home and drew the pictures. Look what else it says. Let's see. Haeckel's confession got lost after his drawings were subsequently used in a 1901 book called Darwin After Darwin and reproduced widely in English language textbooks. And it's been stuck there ever since. Here are photographs through a microscope of really what the embryos look like. The camera doesn't lie. And up here are originals of Haeckel's drawings. Look at the differences. They don't look that way. If evolution were true, you wouldn't have to lie in science to prove it, if it was true. Look at what George Gaylord Simpson says in 1965, a very famous evolutionist, it is now firmly established that ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. And this was called the biogenetic law. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. How many ever remember hearing that before from biology class? Ontogeny, in other words, your origins, recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, your family history. In other words, your embryo development recaps your evolutionary family history, family tree. Look at this is Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most famous evolutionists of the 20th century. He wrote many, many books, and he says this in the year 2000 in an article in Natural History magazine called Abscheulich, which means atrocious in German. We should not, therefore, be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks. That's the 1800s. We shouldn't be surprised about that. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of those drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks. At least Dr. Gould is ashamed of this. If I was an evolutionist, I'd be ashamed of it. I'd say, get that out of the books. It's given the creationists good, ammo against us, showing us that we're not honest. If I was an evolutionist, I'd be angry about this being in the book, and he was. Now, look at what I found here at the University of California, Berkeley, UCal Berkeley website. It was posted in 2002, but it's still there today. Chicken embryo with gill slits. Human embryo with gill slits. Now, I already explained to you, every embryologist on the planet knows those are not gill slits. But on the Evo Library, Evo site at UCal Berkeley, it says they're gill slits. And they're not. So don't think, oh, this is something, Dr. Jackson, that the evolutionists have given up on. Please don't make fun of them for something they're really not doing. They are. There it is. Go look it up yourself. I can give you that if you haven't had time to write that down. Just go to evolution.berkeley.edu, and you'll be at their Evo site, and you'll see all of this kind of stuff is there. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple other ones briefly, and you can go into detail if you want during our question and answer time. But they'll say that homologous structures, in other words, same structures, the fact that a human and a horse have a front limb that's similar shows we used to be the same thing. I am not kidding. They believe that the Morganucodon rat is the thing that humans and horses both evolved from. That's the mother of all mammals. So, but really, well, I could go into it later at question and answer period. I don't want to get into the details. Also, they'll tell you that we don't need our tailbone or our appendix or our tonsils or our wisdom teeth. Those are just leftovers from back in the day when we used to need them when we were something else. They'll also say this. Look at this about the origin of life in a textbook. Today, we do not believe that life arises spontaneously from non-life. Louis Pasteur proved that 120 years ago. How many of you know who I'm talking about? Louis Pasteur, pasteurized milk, proved life only comes from life. But look what they say. Life, this is a college textbook, Sylvia Mader's 11th edition, Inquiry to Life. When I taught college biology, I taught out of her 7th edition. This is the 11th, and it's very new, like 2002. She says, today we do not believe life arises spontaneously from non-life, and we say that life comes only from life. But the very first living thing had to have come from non-living chemicals. They just stated the cell law, the law that says that life can only come from life, and then they said, but of course, that law must not be true, because evolution is true. And here's Stanley Miller, the Miller-Urey experiment that Malachi King was talking about just a little bit ago. We can go into that into detail and why that is wrong later if you like. How many of you have ever seen this moth picture in the textbook? The moth picture, absolutely ridiculous. You know, this is an evolution. Look, what do you have before the evolution? White moths and black moths. What do you have after the evolution? White moths and any new genes? New DNA? New genetic information? New traits? No. You just have more black ones than you do white ones. That's it. But they're telling you, look, since a change in the frequency or how common or how often the genes occur is our definition of evolution, then evolution has occurred. Well, I guess I believe in evolution then, if that's all evolution is. Look, any change of the frequencies or how often an allele in the gene pool shows up, that signifies that evolution has occurred. That's microevolution. that Mr. Foltz was talking about, that is just a change in the number of things that were already there. This process will never get you from worms to bald eagles, which is what they believe happened. The horse series, many, many problems with it. How many of you have ever seen that in a textbook? There you go. I believe it's in your Indiana State book also. And how many of you have heard that germs are evolving to be resistant to our antibiotic drugs? Now they're immune. Yes, that's a total lie. Every microbiologist on this planet knows that is not really happening. It's an urban myth, I promise you. And how many have ever seen this picture in a book there? It's Darwin's finches, about how the finch beaks changed and everything. And Peter and Rosemary Grant wrote a book, The Beak of the Finch. They spent 10 years studying the Galapagos Island finches just in the 1990s, I think it was. And oh boy, this is used by evolutionists all the time. But I had one professor at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, say to me, well, Dr. Jackson, how do you explain that? He said some of those finch beaks grew 12 times their original length in just 10 years. And I said, well, do you believe that mutations and natural selection can work fast enough to change a beak to 12 times longer in only 10 years? He said, well, no. Well, then what makes you think that's evolution? That's just breeding. That's just breeding. It's just reshuffling the genes that are already there. As soon as conditions went back to normal, the baby finches started being born with smaller and smaller beaks. It's not the kind of thing that can get you from amoebas to giraffes and T-Rexes. Dr. Richard Feynman was a genius. They wrote a book about his life called Genius. And if you saw the movie Infinity with Matthew Broderick, it's the story of his relationship with his lovely wife during the time when he was helping to invent the atomic bomb. He was a scientist at Oak Ridge National Laboratories. Also, he was the scientist who discovered why the space shuttle blew up in the 1980s. Dr. Feynman says science is a long history of learning how not to fool ourselves. Evolutionists are fooling themselves, but they shouldn't be fooling our kids. Look, if it's a guess or a supposition, it shouldn't be in our book. You know, the book should only, you know John Hefner, our common friend, a creation speaker in Texas. John is a Texas resident, born in Texas, and he testified as the head of the math department of Kilgore High School and an adjunct math professor at the local college, Kilgore College. He testified before the Texas State Board of Education and showed them some of these frauds that I'm talking about. And they said, well, Professor Hefner, what does that matter, you know, in the textbooks? He said, well, all I'm saying is, what's wrong with the truth? John said, well, what's wrong with the truth? Why don't we just take anything that we know is false out of the book? That's all I'm asking. Of course, that didn't somehow work.